This is the official website for Railway Empire. And Railway Empire came out in 2018, and I bought it almost immediately out of the store. And the install disk was basically a Steam install disk. But it did include the license code I needed to put it on Steam. And I already had a Steam account from Grid Autosport, which I've done another video about. That was my first Steam game. Also was from a box that's in the video, actually. And it's still a little bit expensive because it's new, $28.99. That's euros, not dollars. They will allow you to buy a disc, but I am skeptical as to whether that's really a disc. I suspect that's just another Steam deal like what I had. But system requirements, actually not. They're not actually all that extreme. 8 gig of RAM is quite a lot, but it is a graphics. I don't know if you'd call it a graphics intensive game by modern standards, but it's pretty nice when it comes to graphics. They have a bunch of videos here demonstrating the graphic quality. We'll be taking a look at the actual game in a bit. Now, here it goes through some of the, I don't know what you'd call it, statistics about it in Wikipedia's page on Railway Empire. So, it was released in 2018 originally for Windows, Linux, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One, and then in 2020 for Nintendo Switch. And there are a bunch of DLCs you can get for it. These generally are off of Steam. They're especially promoting the Mexican one and the Japanese one. I don't have either of them. I guess the reason is that I have a lot of transport strategy games. They only gave it a score of 74 on Metacritic. If I were to summarize what it really is, it's basically a modern take on Railroad Tycoon, especially Railroad Tycoon 2, although the graphics are on a whole other level. Even though the graphics are not necessarily realistic, they are very attractive, as you'll see. The locomotives have been modeled very nicely. They're the nicest thing in the game. The railroad cars, not so much. They're kind of cartoonish. And they're not necessarily prototypical either. They seem to be kind of a generic mixture of all railroad equipment from around the world, and that never really looks realistic. Now, I'll prove myself when I show you the game. If I were to think of anything else before we go to the game, I would say the financial model is somewhat akin to Railroad Tycoon 2. It has pretty sophisticated single player with AI opponents. So that's an advantage over Transport Fever and over Mashinky as well, at least the current version of Mashinky, as of 2021 when I'm making this video. And it has a ride-along feature for the trains, just like Transport Fever and Transport Fever 2. I would argue it's closer to Transport Fever 2. It isn't really anything like the Mashinky ride-along feature because you can't drive the trains, however unrealistically. And the acceleration of the trains is very, very fast compared with real life. It's fast even for a car, so it's totally unrealistic. But this is not really a simulation per se. This is a strategy game, so this is much more Railroad Tycoon than Train Simulator. No question about it. And let's see what else I know. Calypso Media. I only know Calypso Media as the developers of, or the publishers of Tropico. That's mostly what they're known for. If we go to their Wikipedia page here, they have Tropico on here, of course. And see if there are any other hits. Well, Jurassic Park, the game. That was from 2012. I don't know if you can really argue that that's so impressive. It's a little bit late off the ball in that regard. Airline Tycoon 2? Well, I mean, there's a Tycoon game for you. Not necessarily endorsed by Sid Meier or the descendant companies of Microprose, but there it is. And yeah, these seems to be in order from newest to oldest. Let's see if there's anything else here worth looking at. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else on here. So anyway, I think this is about all I can say about the Wikipedia and main pages. I'll be more easily able to demonstrate the differences once I boot up the game itself. So anyway, we start in the main menu here. And so we see all the different options here. They have this little promotion window here for the DLCs. So Mexico, they're really pushing hard, and they have all these others too. Most of them are regional. It just makes sense because you get a scenario and a map and a lot of rolling stock. If you load save games. You have campaigns, just like in Railroad Tycoon 2. It's not making it too obvious from this menu, but you know, you do one chapter after another. And the default game only includes the United States, so you also have the scenarios for the United States. You can get an additional DLC for the Great Lakes, but generally, if you're only interested in American trains, you don't need the DLCs, really. As you'll see later, the selection of locomotives, at least for the US, is really nice. But of course, you can get the Mexico DLC. You can look at the DLCs that are available through this menu here. So just because you don't have them loaded doesn't mean it won't tell you about them. So Japan there, and so on. And you have the free mode and the sandbox mode. Sandbox mode obviously doesn't challenge you at all. You just get to play trains, basically, just like in Railroad Tycoon 2. The challenges are special scenarios, basically. I'm not sure how else to describe them. And it tells you what you have to do, and you have some difficulty preferences over there on the right. Doesn't look like you can alter them easily, though. They're grayed out, so I don't know. I've never tried the challenges. I've been experimenting with the free game, mostly. I wanted to know what it was like to play the game, basically, in the most basic way. So all this extra stuff is nice to have, and it's very Railroad Tycoon 2-ish, but nevertheless, I wanted to know about the basics of this. Of course, you have a map editor. They're saying it's difficult to use. I don't know if it is. I haven't tried it. But it's geared especially towards publishing maps to the Steam Workshop. Contributors list, shown over this photo of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. It includes all the people involved in the project. It's a pretty long list, actually. And I was mostly interested in who did the music. Apparently it's a company called Rocket Audio, actually. I think the photos they have in the background are really tasteful, too. They're very nicely chosen, I think. Now, all this choppiness with the credits moving by is because I tried to encode video with the game loaded at the same time. I didn't have this problem later when I was actually playing the game, strangely enough. But the credits have appeared choppy, for whatever reason. And as it's saying, Calypso Media UK are one of the main companies behind the Railway Empire game, and probably some of the DLCs too. I did notice that they've made some rather British mistakes, like for example putting the engineer or train driver on the left on American locomotives, when in fact, in reality, they almost never were on the left. Now we have the preferences here. I think the most relevant preference probably is the graphics preference, so that you can adapt the game to the performance of your computer. Now you can see I've already done one game with the East free mode scenario. You can see the sheriff's badge there is marked. I didn't get a very good score, but that was my test game for this. So my mature game that I'm about to show you is in fact that game. And most of the preferences there have to do with the years that you play. I played the longest possible set of years, from 1830 to 1930, and it still stopped me early in 1910. Basically because my score was so low. I didn't go bankrupt, but they have relatively high standards. Basically, Railway Empire is very easy to play badly. However, it's not so easy to play well. It's not exactly like Simutrans, but it's also not exactly like Mashinky. Because Mashinky is very easy, actually. Now, they sometimes autosave your save games to the cloud, which I don't like. I'll delete that one there. You play a character. You have to select a character from the selections. So I selected the scientist there. And this is the saved game after my score was completed. I'm going to go into that. And when this loads up, we'll take a look at the interface for the game itself. The lighting really varies, although there's not actually a night time. You just basically have different lighting throughout the day when it's always daytime. So you have the obvious choices: demolition, track construction, building construction, train construction, up in the upper right there. Now, you can't easily just lay track in the middle of nowhere, as you can see. You have to connect it to a station. So I click all over the place here in the hills, and it's not actually the terrain that's stopping me building. I can build off a track and I can build off a station, but I can't build in the middle of nowhere. There might be settings that you can have in the game that will let you do that, but I found you basically have to have a station first. So if I connect to the track there, it lets me build. Now, one other thing I should add is you're able to lay the track before you pay for it. And if you have the refunds activated, well, you can also scrap the track right away and get a refund. But it's nice to know what something costs before you actually spend the money. So, building construction. The stations are a little bit cantankerous. You have to put them in cities, otherwise you're having to use warehouses. You can build a station in the middle of nowhere if it's a, for example, maintenance station or a warehouse, but you can't build a station in the middle of nowhere. So it has to be connected to something, either an industry or a town. You also can hire employees for your trains and your offices and so on. Weirdly enough, they're not required, but the idea is that if you hire them, they give you certain advantages. So I put them on my express trains, and I have an office staff in this game, but I didn't put a crew on every train because you're not required to do it. If you look at the people logo there up in the upper left, that's where you hire employees, incidentally. That's where I just was. You also can go to your engine shed here, really a turntable, and you can look at the locomotives you have. This is my favorite part of the game. So this looks to be an E3, or possibly somebody's reinterpretation of an E3 to make it look more like an E7. And most of these locomotives are completely authentic. So it's a big advantage over Mashinky, where they're partly fictional, or, for example, Transport Tycoon, where they're totally fictional, almost, not completely. This is very authentic. They make them generic by changing the paint scheme, so the paint schemes are not always authentic. But otherwise, like the Grasshopper there, that's based on the Atlantic, in the Baltimore and Ohio. The Grasshopper was the class. The Atlantic was the first of them. The one in the B&O Railroad Museum is actually the Andrew Jackson, even though it's marked Atlantic. John Hancock was another early Baltimore and Ohio locomotive, very similar to the Atlantic. And John Bull. This is a locomotive built for the Camden and Amboy in New Jersey. This is the original configuration from when it was imported from England. But This is the rebuilt version. So they call it the North America, but this is also the John Bull, actually. But this is the rebuilt John Bull with a cowcatcher. And the cowcatcher is on pilot wheels, making it a 240. So there's the old one, there's the new one. The new configuration is what they have in the Smithsonian. And then we have the Dunham. I don't know very much about this one, but it's clearly based on a Norris type, which is also called a Jervis type, because Jervis was earlier in developing a 420. This actually is the Jervis from 1832. John B. Jervis is generally a very interesting guy to study. I don't know exactly where this American was from, but all of these, to the best of my knowledge, are based on real-life locomotives. Reindeer, this is an American standard, much more typical American standard, very early one. Philadelphia, this is I believe an early Baldwin. Another American standard, but this one's called the Rensselaer. The American standards in Railway Empire are mostly based on specific locomotives, because in the 19th century, most of the locomotives were either one-offs, or if they were a class, they were basically each made individually, so you had to machine all the parts custom for them. A Dragon, that's another real-life locomotive. These were all fairly unique, so it made sense for Railway Empire to include specific locomotives. There's the original consolidation, there's a later consolidation. I haven't been able to locate the origin of this particular consolidation, but basically it's supposed to represent later consolidations with the bigger boilers. And this is the original Lehigh Valley consolidation from 1866, I believe. But it's repainted, because none of these paint schemes are authentic, except for maybe the Baltimore and Ohio locomotives. There's a Decapid. They're letting you have this in 1868, but if I'm not mistaken, this was slightly later. Basically, I spent a lot of innovation points. Baldwin 10-wheeler. They have a whole bunch of 10-wheelers also, as well as these American standards in different names, based on different specific real locomotives. This is a Mastodon. These are very, very rare in real life. I suspect that, like the Decapid, it's kind of a generic composite of different ones. And there's a Shay. And there is 999 from the New York Central. This one was the one that allegedly broke the 100-mile-an-hour barrier. And not everybody believes that. Most of the people who don't believe it are British. But this is the original configuration with the 86-inch drivers, which I think is really cool. And you can build a fleet of these. It's not a special experimental in Railway Empire. There's another Shay, slightly later design. Shays were geared locomotives, really handy on hills. They were used a lot on logging railroads. I haven't used one in Railway Empire yet, because they're sometimes hard to find a purpose for in a video game. There's a Columbian, or Columbia 242. These were rare in America too, but they were a little bit more common internationally. It sounds as if they gave this one a European-style whistle in Railway Empire. There's a specific class of locomotives. That's a PRR D12 class American Standard, one of the last American Standard classes. There's a Rogers 10-wheeler. This is an Illinois Central design, built by Rogers, of course, and this was the locomotive driven by Casey Jones. They've removed the number, which would have been 382, and they've removed the Illinois Central markings, but otherwise it's original. This is an Atlantic, but this is a camelback Atlantic with the cab in the middle, so that the large firebox can be put on the rear there to burn anthracite. These were used by, among other railroads, the Central of New Jersey. This is a Prairie. Prairies were originally express locomotives, but very quickly were transitioned into mixed traffic on branch lines and short lines during the 20th century. And they basically were around until the end of steam. This one might be a Baldwin. I'm not completely sure about the origins of this one. That is a Pacific. It's based on Reading Blue Mountain and Northern number 425. It's another Baldwin. That I know for a fact is a Baldwin. Originally built for the Gulf Mobile in Northern, which was the predecessor to the Gulf Mobile in Ohio. And this is a pretty typical Pacific for the early 20th century. And these were used to the end of steam. There's a Mountain. This is a USRA Mountain, painted red, or some kind of orangish reddish color. Not very authentic, but the locomotive is authentic. One of the biggest freight locomotives in the World War I era, which was not articulated. Here's the old mod. This is an experimental articulated, built by the Baltimore and Ohio in 1903. The incorrect date in-game is due to innovation points again. There's a Mikado. That seems to be loosely based on an USRA Mikado, except the sandbox has been moved back one segment of the boiler, and the drivers are smaller than average for a Mikado. And there's a Melee. This appears to be a Chesapeake and Ohio Melee, maybe an H3 class, based on 1309, which is actually in preservation and actually runs. And there's a Berkshire. This is not the original Lima Berkshire from 1925, but this is a Baldwin. So this is similar to what would have been used on the Santa Fe and allegedly on the Boston and Maine, although I don't know whether that's really the case or whether there are just a lot of models marked for Boston and Maine for this one. The feed water heater on the front is the spotting feature that shows it's not a real Lima. And there's a Santa Fe. These were very, very heavy freight locomotives that the Santa Fe bought in the teens. And then they brought in heavier ones later. But this is not one of them. This is a Hudson. This is a J1 Hudson of the New York Central Railroad. These are far too rare in games, in my opinion. They're really, really cool. They were designed for basically pulling the 20th Century Limited, although the New York Central used them on all kinds of other express services too. And there's a Super Hudson from 1938. They originally built them in 37, but without the streamlining. And they're offering this in 1907, but that's because I won it in 1907 while playing the game. It's not when it's offered in the game, because in the game, it's not a given that you'll get a locomotive in a particular year. This, again, is down to innovation points, as I said earlier. Now, the Texas is another Santa Fe locomotive that was a development of the Santa Fe. It's got a four-wheel trailing truck for a bigger firebox. So this was very, very heavy for its day. But it's the heaviest thing you can get, other than the Mallet. But in any case, you could add tons more locomotives, but that's a very nice selection. It's my favorite thing about the game. The models are beautiful. The choices are really tasteful. I love everything about it. Now, there's my character, Doc Murphy. Obviously based on Doc Brown from Back to the Future, obviously. But my company's called American Central. That's not my idea. That's the game's idea. I didn't bother to rename it. And I have these different special things that I get. I believe these were given to me with Doc Murphy, actually, as a character, because the different characters give you different advantages as a CEO. So that's my yearly report of my accounts. It gives me my competitors, which are none. You have the option of competitors in Railway Empire. I chose to play without them in this case. You can get bonds, just like in Railroad Tycoon 2. It's the main way you finance things. And let's see what else is here. Well, tasks, company. Tasks is basically where you see what your goals are for that scenario, because they give you specific goals to achieve. I have not achieved very many, so my score is really pathetic in this particular game. I wasn't actually trying to achieve any of these. I was just trying to have a working company. I think that if I were to play this over, I would try to achieve more of these. But it's how they calculate your score, basically. Let's see what else we have here. Cities and buildings. One of the disadvantages is they don't tell you what businesses you own, because just like in Railroad Tycoon 2 and 3, you can buy industries, even build some buildings in the cities. And they don't have a list that you can call up. You have to go city by city to see what you own, which I don't particularly like. It would be nice if they had a list feature. So in New York City, where I have the most stuff, I own all the industries, as you can see, and I built a university. And the universities increase your technology score. See, you have their innovation points there, and then you can buy innovations with that. That's why the introductory dates of my locomotives are not completely accurate, because I just got the locomotives as fast as I could, and some of them I got too early, some of them I got too late. There's the E unit there. I only actually have 3 technologies I haven't bought, because I'm at the end of the game here. 20 innovation points per month. That varies with how many universities you have, and it varies with which character you're playing. Doc Murphy is the one that has the highest rate, of course, because he's the scientist. Or the engineer, but they mean scientist. And this is why I have EMD units in 1912. So here's my system. I built the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad, and then I added some other stuff. The Atlantic coastline and the southern main line to Atlanta, as well as the Buffalo and Pittsburgh, and whatever that line is from Toledo down to Montgomery. I don't know if that's authentic at all. Probably not exactly. Here's the old PRR main line. I built that also, although there's not a lot of business on it. Philadelphia has been omitted. Detroit is missing. A lot of major cities are missing from this map, actually. But I fared the best I could. I think they want you to adapt to the situation they give you, generally speaking. Boston's not on the map either, although that's partly because Massachusetts is cropped off, you see. You don't even have all of Long Island there. That's a subject for a DLC, I guess. But there in New York City, I have both the classic stations. I have Grand Central and I have Penn. Then I added this thing I call River Yard up here, which is probably not really authentic, but I needed a freight yard to ease the traffic on the passenger stations, because one disadvantage of railway empire is that you can't have more than 4 tracks in a station. It's a huge traffic management problem, because once you get going, you know as well as I do, if you've played a lot of these games, just like in real life, you get a lot of trains you want to run through these stations, and 4 tracks is simply not enough. But anyway, this is the Crescent Limited. This is actually not leaving from New York City here, even though I have it scheduled to. I'm actually in Washington Union, and we will ride this train down to Charlotte. Of course, it will terminate in Atlanta, but just to give an example, I have the Pacific on the point there, based on Blue Mountain Reading and Northern number 425, not based on any of the Southern Pacifics, which are in the famous green livery. One of those ended up in the Smithsonian, actually. I believe that was a PS4 class. Some people consider it the most beautiful American locomotive, although all of this stuff is subjective, of course. This was a nice locomotive, too. But it's the only Pacific they give you without any DLCs, so I put it on the Crescent Limited because why not? Charlotte is called Charlotte 1 here. That was not intentional. Sometimes they'll give the stations numbers if you put more than one in the city. I don't know why they did it here because I only have one Charlotte station. I think I'll go fix that before I continue. I didn't even know I had that problem. Now there's Charlotte. I want to come up. You see, if you can click the station specifically instead of just the city. There we go. Charlotte 1. Why does it say Charlotte 1? That doesn't make any sense, because I only have one station for Charlotte. Alright. Is there anything else I need to do? I guess not. I guess I'll go back to the Crescent. So we'll continue riding the Crescent here. It's going 66 miles an hour. It's a pretty realistic prototypical speed for a really old Pacific. They could go 70, 75, 80, but in service, 60, 70. The acceleration in Railway Empire is not modeled realistically at all. These trains speed up much too fast, they slow down much too fast. Faster than a car, really, which is wildly unrealistic. But it's not really a simulator, in my opinion. A lot of people call these strategy games simulations, but I don't like that term because it's really about running the business. It's not really about driving trains. You can't drive trains in Railway Empire at all. You can ride along like this, but I'm not driving here. I mean, the computer is driving. And you have the newspapers, just like in Railroad Tycoon 2. Most of the news in the American scenario is about Japan, and I don't know why that is. They don't have any period news about the US, only Japan, except for the Titanic. Titanic isn't a Japanese ship. But the news which is not railway related or connected to the game is generally about Japan, and I have no idea why that is. Seems like a weird choice. Here's a Mikado with some probably milk tankers. I've said before that the railroad cars are not really authentic. They seem to be generic mixtures of many different nationalities. And when you get a cargo, you get an appropriate freight car or passenger car for that cargo. So you don't have to worry about what you're going to marshal into the train, which is nice. It's a lot like Railroad Tycoon 2 in that way too. But like I said, the rolling stock they give you is not really authentic or authentic looking. It's very cartoonish compared with the locomotives. You can add a caboose, by the way. I should add that. You can add a caboose, you can add a dining car, you could add mail cars, which don't actually carry anything, they just improve the performance of the train for you. Again, kind of a construct you'd see in a game. So if I go into the menu here, I have the elevation of the route, I have the locomotive's performance, even with the mods I've added, like the employees here, the personnel. I have the water, the oil, and the sand there. I have performance in practice, like how fast it will run. It'll top out at 85, apparently, at least on this route. But it doesn't generally go 85. And I can go to other trains there with the arrow keys. And then I have the rail cars here. So on the Crescent, I've given a dining car and a mail car, because that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to have a refrigerator car or caboose. But as you can see, it improves the performance. It doesn't actually carry any of your payload, you could say, any of your revenue, freight, or passengers. There's the water, there's the oil, there's the sand, as I said before. Unlike Transport Fever and some of these other games, you do have to have maintenance stations for the locomotives. That's realistic, even if it's implemented in a sort of unrealistic way. So you put in, works in the cities for when the train has to be serviced. You put in the little maintenance stations you saw earlier with the water towers and so on. You do need that to keep the trains running properly, which is very different from Transport Fever. And it's one of the more realistic features of Railway Empire, even if, as I said, there are many realism defects in this too. You can't have everything, obviously. Here's the dining car. And of course you have all these semaphore signals. I put in these by hand. And they're much more accurate than Mashinky, I'll give them that. They're not perfect, but they're pretty good. At least in the context of Railway Empire as a game. You don't get any approach signals, you only get danger and clear. But because the trains don't behave realistically, you don't really need them to be any better. And you have this mafia stuff, like the mafia are always harassing you for bribes and so on in this. I haven't seen any train robberies yet, but allegedly that's another feature built into this. Sometimes your train can get robbed. But I didn't see that when I was playing the game. Railroad Tycoon 2, you certainly get the trains robbed. And how many robbers you have depends on your security measures. There's one of the maintenance stations I mentioned earlier. They only really fill your water and coal. Well, not coal. They fill your water, your oil, and your sand. They don't maintenance the locomotive. You need your works for that. So generally, when the locomotive is in between runs somewhere, it'll be serviced. You can see the works over there on the right. So the purpose of that is not to build locomotives, because you can build them whether you have them or not, unlike Transport Tycoon and Mashinky and Transport Fever. But you do need the works for maintenance. So you can see how the trains get loaded there, where they give you rolling stock that matches whatever you're picking up. So here I picked up passengers and mail, so I got passenger and mail cars. And that's basically all you need to know. I guess we'll go and play a game from scratch now. So, Railway Empire has this launcher here and this splash screen. And then it has this introductory CGI video. It's nowhere near this choppy in most cases. The reason it's choppy here is that I'm simultaneously trying to run the game and run Open Broadcaster. And it's a little bit too much for my computer to take. Hopefully you get some idea of how cool this video is. I actually like it. It's not photoreal, of course, and there are some inaccuracies in it historically, but Still a cool video. Again, you either get the game or maybe find somebody who has a more powerful computer who have taken a capture of this. Back to the splash screen to load the game. And so we will do the free mode here for the sake of simplicity. And we'll do the same scenario I did for the previous game. The full 100 years there, even though it's not really the full 100 years. So with the Great Lakes in the north, the Atlantic in the east, and the Appalachian Mountains in the center, there's less arable land available in this area than in others. Those areas that can be cultivated are therefore densely populated for the most part. Anyway, so start in New York with 3 competitors this time. Advanced settings, regular tasks, and so on. I won't actually pursue the tasks very aggressively, in all honesty. I'll just try to build a working railway that doesn't lose a tremendous amount of money. Now, of course, they have the characters that you can play, all the various ones. The general and gangster, and they're all in their Christmas, costumes here because there are seasonal costumes that they wear. So in Halloween they have, horror-themed costumes, and Christmas they have these Christmas-themed costumes. So the industrialist. This guy is presented as the engineer, Doc Murphy, as opposed to the scientist. But he's supposed to be, based on Doc Brown from Back to the Future, I'm nearly certain of.
My colleagues simply don't have what it takes.
So
I always tell the truth.
You can play any of the characters. I think I'm probably going to go with Doc Murphy again, just because I'm familiar with how the game behaves when he's the character you're playing. And we'll keep the American Central company name. I'm going to make this game very, very simple, because it's a very, very slow, time-consuming game, and if I really went all out and paid off the debts of the company and so on, we would be talking about a 2 or 3 hour video. That would probably make more sense for a long play, rather than just a basic playthrough. So here we are with the east coast of the US again, and I'll try to pause. And it won't let me pause. So I should go back, change the settings. The pause mode has to be manual for the spacebar pause function to work. Something I forgot to mention, or remember even when I set up the game. So let's try this again. So we will wait for it to load here. Funnily enough, the freight train in that splash screen looks more realistic than a lot of the freight trains in the game. Okay, so the task list is created. We get the advice from our advisor there. And there's New York City. I'm going to put in a top-of-the-line large train station with signaling control here, because this will be my headquarters, more or less. You can actually fine-tune the rotation by holding down Control. I'd say read the instructions. Now the trickiest thing about this particular route, I'm going to try and build the Northeast Corridor too, Baltimore and in Washington is we have this dairy farm here, which is handy. It's good to have. It gives me additional freight business. But it causes the line to be kinked because you can't run the line through the farmland. The station has to be adjacent to it, but it can't be on it, which is different from the cities, because in the cities you can put a station directly inside a city. And I'm opting for a conventional passenger and freight station at this location instead of a warehouse, because the configuration is automatic. When you do the warehouses, you have to specify what freight will be handled. So it's a little bit more of a pain to administer. Here I'll just use a large train station for Baltimore. The reason I'm setting up the stations first is that it's easier to lay the track and get the proper grades. Grading track in Railway Empire is a bit of a pain. They tend to give you grades which are unrealistically difficult, and the correct blasting and bridging and so on, filling, is often not implemented properly. The City of Washington is refusing your permission. I guess maybe I won't get to Washington. At least not in this playthrough, because it will take too long probably to set all that up properly if I can't set it up in the beginning. I'll just see what happens if I put in a main line to Baltimore. And still I need to borrow money to do that. So, anyway, let's try and put in the track. I could put in a 4-track main, except I don't have the money. Again, financial considerations, right? So I will connect New York City to this dairy farm, which is called Nolan Breeding. Completely fictional as far as I know. And Philadelphia, as you'll notice, is missing from the map. Also, so I'm already out of money. So, another bond is needed. This is going to be tight financially. It's partly why I don't think I'm going to add Washington before the end of this playthrough. Just because it's very easy to run out of credit, I've found. At least in this particular scenario. I guess if I had capitalized the company for $2 million instead of $1 million, I wouldn't have had this issue, but I wanted to go with the default so that it didn't look like I was taking it easy. At least not too easy. So this will be a 2-track main, not a 4-track main, getting back to what I was saying earlier, to save money in the short term. But I've chosen all 4-track stations, so making it 4-track would not really be all that difficult, actually, if I had the financing. The most difficult thing about building 4-track mains in Railway Empire is the tunnels, because there isn't a 4-track tunnel, and then as soon as you have to start tunneling, it gets to be kind of spaghetti, because you have to figure out a way to get the tracks around each other and then back together at the correct grade. And I would argue that Railroad Tycoon 2 and a lot of the other railway strategy games implement this better. I wouldn't say that Sid Meier's Railroads implements it very well, but most of the other strategy games handle it better than Railway Empire. Transport Tycoon is a little bit tricky with it because I don't think they thought that out very carefully when they were developing the game originally. Basically, the tracks tend to be too far apart in that case, and so you start running out of land. But it at least doesn't fight you to the same degree as Railway Empire does when you try to 4-track. Alright, let's see. I need a crossover. I don't have enough room to put it in here. So maybe a crossover on the other side of the river here. That worked out. I'll put in the signaling, because I will be running multiple trains on this. Almost no point in having 2 tracks unless I'm going to be running a whole bunch of traffic. Maybe a crossover here. I think that's a good idea because I'm going to be probably running a milk train from Nolan Breeding to Baltimore and a milk train from Nolan Breeding to New York. And so the trains are going to have to be able to switch tracks when they pull out. Or pull in, for that matter. I'll signal it. I'm going to put in some intermediate signals too, but that'll be next. Crossover. I'm out of money. And I don't have any more bonds that I can apply for. So maybe what I need to do, let's see, if I build a train now, let's see if I can afford to do that. I'm skeptical of that, but let's give it a try. Otherwise, I'm basically finished with this game. I will have already lost, unless I can do that. So the Grasshopper is too expensive for me, even with the discount from having the Doc Murphy character. So, I guess the only way to raise the money is to scrap some of the railway line that I'm not going to use immediately, and use the refund to pay for the locomotive. Which is a sloppy way of doing this, but I don't see a better way. So, bulldoze. These crossovers are really tricky to bulldoze properly. And they don't let you bulldoze railway lines in sections the way they would in a lot of other strategy games, which annoys me because it wastes a huge amount of your virtual money and wastes a lot of your time. Get rid of the signal. I don't need the signal anymore for now. First, I'm not going to have any milk trains because I can't afford them. That crossover will not bulldoze. It's not cooperating with me at all. Yeah, I don't like the interface in Railway Empire tremendously because of stuff like this. It's really irritating stuff that probably should have been dealt with earlier on. I mean, there are some clear advantages to Railway Empire over, for example, Transport Fever, in the sense that you can have opponents, and the business model is in some ways a lot more realistic. But there are also things like this. There are some sloppy things about the way it's been built, and they've chosen to limit the realism in certain ways that I don't love. I mean, even though neither of them is really a proper simulation if you're comparing Railway Empire and Transport Fever. I think I'm just going to have to cut that connection there. I don't need it for the moment. One thing I like about Transport Fever over Railway Empire, I'll just get rid of the whole line there. One of the main things I like is that the individual passengers are simulated, as in Simutrans. Whereas here they're not. The passengers walking around are basically dynamic scenery. So even when you click pause, they still continue to walk around, the wagons continue to drive around. And they really have nothing to do with the gameplay. They're just there for scenery. Whereas in Transport Fever, they are actually your individual customers. So in that way, Transport Fever is much more interesting. Especially because you can also follow them in their daily lives, as I've shown in a previous video. And in Transport Fever 2, all of that is simulated to a much more sophisticated degree. And I do hope to do a playthrough of Transport Fever 2 in the near future. Just have to see how long it takes for me to get to that, given all of the stuff I have planned in train simulations and strategy games. I'm trying to run through all the ones I know well, and including some of the ones that I don't know so well. It's a whole genre, if you will. You could even argue that train simulators and train strategy games are separate genres. I find it very interesting that with the ease with which you can distribute video games nowadays through Steam and so on, and for that matter through the Google Play Store, how the choices in terms of railway games are vastly greater than they ever used to be. Okay, this looks like I can't actually clean this up now. I should just build that train. This is getting ridiculous. Okay, so why is he not pulling out? There he is, finally pulling out. So we get to see a train carrying mostly beer from the look of it in these very old-fashioned tanker cars. Whether that's really realistic is something I'm skeptical of. I think probably they would have used boxcars full of barrels. But there we go. This type of tanker was more common for hauling pickles, believe it or not, back in the day. Heinz had a fleet of them, because Heinz was originally a pickle company and not a ketchup company. And they actually often still bill themselves as such. If you look at their official logo, it's actually the Heinz lettering in a pickle. So my little grasshopper steam locomotive is chugging along at 11 miles an hour here. This isn't necessarily an unrealistic speed for a vintage freight train. But as you progress through the technology, the trains do become unrealistically fast for America. Until basically the 20th century stuff, and then the speeds become accurate again. I certainly like the ride-along feature at Railway Empire as well as in Transport Fever, and even more so in Transport Fever 2 because you can move the camera around. You can actually move the camera around here, as you can see. You can have different views, you can pan a little bit using the center button on the mouse. So, given that this came out before Transport Fever 2, you can argue that at the time it was superior to what Transport Fever had to offer. So we're moving right along here. We're not going to make a stop at Nolan Breeding because this train is only a mixed train between New York and Baltimore. I don't think I'm going to get to separate passenger and freight trains on this, in part because all the locomotives will be mixed traffic until the end of this, probably. Now, hopefully when that train pulls into Baltimore, it will become possible to clean up all this track that I had to scrap in order to pay for it. So it looks like Baltimore has some meat ready to depart. Weirdly enough, you don't need refrigerated cars for that. You can add a refrigerated car to the train to improve your score, of course, but they just automatically give you boxcars, which is not really very realistic. Even back in the mid-19th century, there were ice bunker reefers that were used for meat transport. One of the fleets was actually owned by Swift rather than by the railroads. Although I think in 1830 they didn't even have that. 1830 is really early days for the railways. It'd be early even for Britain, because it wasn't until 1830 that regularly scheduled passenger trains were introduced in Britain. Although in America, everything sort of happened at once in 1830 because it was the year that the Baltimore and Ohio was founded. And even though the Delaware and Hudson predated the Baltimore and Ohio, basically the Baltimore and Ohio was the first modern railroad in the U.S. with both freight and passenger services pulled by steam locomotives. So, let's see. It looks like I've been able to rebuild most of this. I still need to put a crossover here. So I have to go... yeah, but I forgot. I have to put it on the other side of the river. I've already forgotten my own planning here. For some reason, I didn't scrap it. What's up with that? I removed the signal, but I didn't remove the track? I don't remember that at all. That's weird. Okay. Well, it's less I have to do, I guess. Alright, so now... I don't actually need a crossover here because it's built into that elaborate, fully signaled station for New York. I'm not calling it Grand Central or Penn, I'm just calling it New York. So I guess if I just put in the signaling, that's all we need. And then some intermediate signals will be in order. I guess maybe if I... Let's see what the best location for that is. Look a little bit more carefully here. You can see the dynamic scenery, people riding their wagons around the streets there and walking the sidewalks. They're giving us the news article akin to Railroad Tycoon 2, although that's about the resettlement or the, unfortunately, the Indian removal policy of the U.S. government at the time. So you can see the panning feature using the center mouse button here. The train is departing with boxcars with meat. And I should add that these boxcars are not authentic for any purpose in the U.S. I don't think the U.S. ever had boxcars quite like these. They're very European looking. Let's see. Is there anything we have to look at here? Like, yeah, I was thinking intermediate signals. That was what I wanted to do next. I also need a maintenance building, because it's free, and I have to worry about what's going to happen to that train if I don't coddle it as much as possible. Because you do have to take care of your trains here in a way that Transport Fever oversimplifies a great deal. As does Mashinky, actually. Not every railway strategy game takes maintenance into account other than as an expense. The more realistic ones, arguably like this one, but also Railroad Tycoon 2, do require you to have maintenance facilities to support your trains. Otherwise, your trains start to run out of oil, run out of water, run out of sand, malfunction more generally. And in Railway Empire, they sustain visually noticeable damage. Mostly they get dirty if you don't have appropriate works wherever they're going to be operating. But it's a lot more than appearances because they do not run correctly unless they're maintained properly. So that's a realistic feature of Railway Empire that you can praise as you wish. As you can see, this is not photoreal, it just looks kind of nice. And the physics are totally wrong, but some aspects of the business, like maintenance of the trains, well, that's realistically portrayed. At least on some level. So here it's struggling because there's a really heavy grade through that station. I wasn't able to get rid of that anyway. It's one of the many quirks of this, is that the grades tend to be too steep. Luckily, because the physics are not 100% realistic, the trains are still able to make like 5%, 6% grades. They just slow down a lot. In real life, I think you'd have trouble getting any train other than a Shay or obviously a cog railway train up a grade that's too much more than 5%. And 5% would still be too much, arguably. And 3% would be very steep. So you get the idea. This train is still crawling along because it's only a grasshopper. And as I said, that's reasonably accurate. Speeds aren't always realistic in Railway Empire, but when it comes to the grasshoppers, they more or less run at the real-life speed. So, pulling in here. How much money are we going to make? Oh, it could be worse. It's not a lot of money, but let's see if we can buy a milk train or two and raise the rest of the money we need to complete the railway line. For one thing, we don't have the water towers up yet. That's going to be an issue. Alright, so the first milk train will be Nolan breeding 2. I have to decide. Nolan breeding 2, might as well make it New York. New York's the bigger city. Alright. Add a locomotive. We'll choose another grasshopper because it's the only choice. And we have our first milk train. And we have other freight routes we could choose here. I guess... yeah, for some reason it doesn't cite New York as a plausible route, but I know that it is. Generally food will go to any city. Let's add another milk train. Or not. I can't decide. Yeah, let's go with one milk train for now, because I don't have enough money to build another one, now that I'm looking at it. So, this will be very slow, going up that grade. But eventually, this train will get to New York. And yeah, we get to ride along with the train here and at least enjoy the ride. One of the other weird quirks of this, I mentioned that when you pause the game, the people keep walking around the streets and the wagons keep rolling and everything. Another thing that happens is that the wind doesn't stop either. So right now that American flag is flapping in the wind as the train rails down the line. If I were to pause this, it would continue flapping in the wind, but at a lower rate, because it would only be the ambient, if that's the right word, wind. It's not created by the forward motion of the train. The wind that already exists would blow the flag around in the wind without the momentum of the train. And there's the mixed train passing on the other track. And we're almost in New York. yearly report. So the annual report. Some of the language has been oversimplified here. It's an annual report, which means yearly. But as you can see, not a lot of money in the first year. Only have 2 trains at the end, and you get the idea. See? The flag is still blowing in the wind even though I'm paused, so now I'm rolling again. Now it's blowing in the wind because the train is going forward. And yeah, so the physics of this are kind of weird. It's not really a simulator. So the train will pull into the platforms in New York, and it'll slam on the brakes to stop faster than a car because the physics are incredibly bad. But we'll see how the milk tankers get removed there, and that locomotive will now have to run light back to Nolan Breeding because there's no cargo that can be carried from New York to Nolan. Now, I would want to build another milk train though, so we'll put in one between Baltimore and Nolan Breeding now. Again, we'll use a grasshopper. And now we might actually make some decent money, because we'll be properly utilizing this line. It could be argued that I should add another mixed train between Baltimore and New York. But let's raise the money for that first, because I do not have it now and I still can't issue bonds. Signals, however, are something I can afford and should put up, because I was going to do them earlier, I never got to it, and now that I have 3 trains on the line, and plan on at least 4, I'm going to want to have adequate blocks for them, so that we're not having all the trains waiting at signals continuously. Obviously, you want to always have one more block than you have trains, and I can't generally go for much more than that, especially because I tend to prefer train games that are more realistic than Railway Empire, which have approach signals and everything else, where the trains can't stop on a dime like they can in Railway Empire, and you have to think ahead about how much congestion is it going to cause if I don't have X number of blocks. One thing I should say is that the signaling blocks in Railway Empire are much more realistic than in Mashinky. That's true. See, I was thinking especially that train up there ahead of this one, because it's blocking me, and I have to wait until it gets out of the block before I can move, and I don't want that to take all day. And that's how Nolan Breeding is going. I can't actually buy it yet. One way you can jack your profits up, of course, just like in Railroad Tycoon 2, is to buy the industries you serve. But just like in Railroad Tycoon 2, that is a very expensive proposition. So if you need that to make your profit, you're not going to make any profit. Basically, it's a way of getting really rich later after you've become moderately rich just doing rail transport. So this signal is not dropping. I guess we're going to be waiting for the block to clear. Because you can't look up at the signal with the views unless you do it deliberately, but you can see the counterweight there. When it moves, you go. But that doesn't matter either, because you're not really driving the train. The train is controlled completely by the computer in Railway Empire. Other than, obviously, you schedule it, so you can tell it where to go that way. But this is not Mashinky, this is not Train Sim World, this is not Train Sim by any manufacturer. This is Railway Empire. So, that milk train is pulling into Baltimore. It would be really nice to do that hop to Washington, but I don't have the money for that yet. I don't even have my water towers up. In fact, I think I'm going to have to call this quits pretty soon, because I've already blown through 35 minutes of gameplay here. This is a rather slow game, and you have to consider I'd never even set up like bus routes or anything because bus routes are not included in Railway Empire. You only have the trains, not even like transit. Alright, so I'll put in a water tower here in New York, since I need one. And I guess maybe if I add the other one in Baltimore, I can call it quits and save this, maybe? That way I have the beginnings of a long play for later if I want to do one. Although, to be honest, I have other long play priorities for the moment. I'd like to do Transport Tycoon Deluxe, for example, and I would like to do Transport Fever 2 once I've done the more basic playthrough. We're going to have to see what I can actually do in real life as opposed to plan. I'm not a professional YouTuber. Can I get any bonds? No, I still can't get any bonds. It's annoying. Alright. So I guess I have to wait until I have enough money to put in that other water tower. And why wait? Well, I need the revenue from the trains because it's my only income stream for now. I don't have any industries. It looks like Baltimore now has an active sawmill there. And of course, if I had a lot more money, I could buy it. But all that really means is there'll be more traffic on my mixed train between New York and Baltimore, and any subsequent ones I build. So 21,000, 23, back to 22. Kind of boring just sitting here. But I don't know what the point there is in watching the trains do the same thing again and again. Where is my money? I'm waiting for my money here. Should I go and watch where those trains are? No, they're not stranded. I was going to say, maybe one of them stuck because I screwed up the signaling somehow, but nothing of the sort. I just have slow grasshoppers taking a while to get to each town. $32,000, is that enough? Yes, okay. So let's put in that water tower for Baltimore. Won't fit there. Maybe beyond the cross. Yeah, we go. Beyond the crossover, I have a water tower now. And I think this is taking a tremendous amount of time. Let's just save it and call it a day. I've shown you what it can do. It's a much more Railroad Tycoon-esque take on the railway strategy game genre. It's not my favorite thing. I think I prefer Railroad Tycoon 2, but this is a more traditional take on this genre, as opposed to Transport Fever with the buses and the trucks and everything. So, thanks for watching.